Okay, students, we're going to go through chapter 25 today, Turmoil Between the Wars. Finals are coming up soon, and I should have an announcement for you either later on today or tomorrow. Um, the legacy of the Great War, near collapse of democracy, the rise of authoritarian dictatorships. Let's see if I can fix this a little bit. Yeah, wait. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay. So, near collapse of democracy and the rise of authoritarian dictatorships. We're going to talk about Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. There was a civil war after World War One in Russia between the White Russians and the Marxists, and the Marxists wound up winning that particular war. Well, it wasn't that long. The United States was involved, and so were some other powers like Japan, Great Britain, and France. We sent troops over there to try and to defeat them, but it didn't happen. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in 1918, and Russia had to give a lot of their land and a lot of their industry to Germany, and they got out of the war. And there was a reason they got out of the war, because they couldn't fight it, because they were going through a revolution on their own and changing power. So what occurred was that Germany actually got Russia to withdraw from the war, and therefore they could take their troops from the Eastern Front, German troops, and move them to the Western Front to fight the Allies. And that's exactly what happened. So the whites, the White Russians, loose group united by the desire to remove the Reds from power, the communists from power, and they were supporters of the old regime, which means they were the supporters of Nicholas II, who had been, his whole family had been executed as a result. So this is a map of the Soviet Union, and it demonstrates basically how large this country is and how difficult it would be to govern. But this is what it looked like starting in 1918 to 1945. The Russian Civil War, the Reds, the Bolsheviks faced strong nationalist movements in the Ukraine, Georgia, and North Caucasus. And these were movements of people who really loved, had pride in their country. That's what a nationalist does. United States, Britain, and Japan intervened on the periphery of the old empire. It solidified Bolshevik mistrust of capitalist world powers. Now, these were the two big leaders, Vladimir Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, from 1870 to 1924. And when he died, he passed power to this gentleman right here, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, who was known as Joseph Stalin. He died in 1952, right after the Cold War started in 1946. But Stalin carried on the principles of Lenin. The Bolshevik victory gained greater support from the majority of the population, better organization, and Leon Trotsky, who was one of Lenin's right-hand men, actually was the new commissar for war. And they went to the United States and asked them for loans. And the United States says, look, if you're not going to fight, I'm not going to give you any loans. And that's exactly what happened. So the consequences were 1 million combat casualties. There were several million dead from hunger and disease. And a total of 100,000 to 300,000 were executed on both sides. Communism does not leave a lot of live people in its wake if you disagree with them. It created permanent hatreds. And we're going to see the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, somewhere around there, hopefully, if we get to it in this class. War communism was a government control of industry, and the government requisitioned grain from the peasantry, and it outlawed private trade in consumer goods, militarized production facilities, and abolished money, because it was anti-capitalist. The consequences were that it devastated Russian industry and emptied major cities. The industrial output in 1920 fell to only 20% of pre-war levels. There was a large-scale famine in 1921 where millions of people died, and there were large-scale strikes. The NEP period, New Economic Policy, the Soviet Union used to come out with these every 5 years. And what happens is they never meet their goals, so they make another plan for 5 years, and it kept going and kept going and kept going. They abandoned war communism and reverted to state capitalism. The state owned all major industries. Individuals could own private property. They traded freely within the limits, and farming land was for the benefit of the peasants. Grain requisitioning replaced by fixed taxes on the peasantry. Nikolai Bukharin was, stated that the peasants should enrich themselves and that taxes would support urban industrialization and the working classes. So the golden age of Russian peasantry took place in Russia during this time, in the Soviet Union during this time. Divided up noble lands to level wealth disparities. There's the share your wealth and land redistribution. And it reintroduced traditional social structure like peasant communes, and it produced enough grain to feed the country. But if they had enough grain to feed the country, why did they have a famine? Because it was a government-controlled famine. They kept food away from the peasants in order to starve them to lessen the population. It failed because the peasants refused to participate in markets to benefit the urban areas. It kept excess grain for themselves. The cities experienced grain shortages, so a lot of people started to starve to death. When the state takes over things like that, that's what happens. Stalin and the revolution from above. Stalin, the man, he was born in Georgia as Iosip Jugashvili. He was exiled to Siberia for revolutionary activity because he believed in Marxism at the time when he was a young man. Upon Lenin's death, there was a choice between Stalin and Trotsky, and Stalin became the new general secretary of the Communist Party, is what they call it. And Trotsky had fled to Mexico, where later in 1940, Stalin sent some hitmen to assassinate him. Stalin, the strategist, he isolated all opposition and used the left to isolate the right, used the right to isolate the left, either one. And by 1929, Trotsky and Bukharin were removed from positions of power. This is Lenin's grave. Lenin is this is what he looks like. He is embalmed every 2 years. And he died in 1924, so that's almost 100 years ago. And 96 years ago, as a matter of fact. And so they keep embalming his body to preserve it. It's still there, even though the Soviet Union's not under communist rule, so that people can see it. And it's exactly the way he died. And this is another photo of what he looks like from the side. I mean, it's almost like they put wax on his face and they keep embalming him and embalming him. Eventually, the tissue's probably going to deteriorate, but now he's still pretty much perfectly preserved. So Lenin dies of a stroke in 1924, and Stalin takes over. He abandoned the new economic plan. He increased the tempo of industrialization, and he forced industrialization and the total collectivization of agriculture. What does that mean? It means that the government takes over the farms. Okay, so then they can regulate everything. Local party and police officials forced peasants to join collective farms, which means that they didn't get an individual salary. It's part of the autonomous collective is what they call it, and they throw everything into one barrel, and then the government gets their share, and then whatever's left over, the people get. Peasant resistance. There were 1,600 large-scale rebellions between 1929 and 1933 by the peasants. And the peasants slaughtered livestock rather than turn it over to the farms. So Stalin began what was known the liquidation of the kulaks, which was a peasant sect. And the famine between 1932 and 1933, it cost 3 to 5 million lives. And the Bolsheviks retained grain reserves in other parts of the country. Grain reserves sold overseas for currency and were stockpiled in the event of war. A problem with that is that if they're not stored properly, they rot. and you can't use them. This was a matter of Stalin's paranoia, okay? Because later on in the 1930s, 1934, 1935, there was a purge of the officer corps where a lot of officers who were seen as not being loyal to Stalin were executed. The 5-year plans, it was a campaign of forced industrialization. The first 5-year plan was from 1928 to 1932. It was the most stunning period of economic growth in the Soviet Union. Industrial output increased 50% in 5 years. They built new industries in new cities. Magnitogorsk was one of the cities that was built. And the urban population more than doubled from 26 to 56 million between 1924 and 1939. So a lot of the times, the populations that they would lose due to the famine in the 1930s would eventually come back with this period of reproduction. The human cost. There were large-scale projects that were carried out with prison labor. These were people who were political prisoners who did not believe what Stalin was doing, were not loyal to him, and they would be basically sent to these camps, and they died. It was like a concentration camp. They weren't on purposefully put to death, but they eventually starved to death. It was known as a Gulag system, where by 1940, 3.6 million were incarcerated by the regime. That's what communism does. If you disagree with them, they suppress your opinion, and then they put you in jail. Structural problems. The command economy. Production levels planned from Moscow in advance. Heavy industry favored over light industry, and there was emphasis on quantity over quality. So a lot of the goods coming out were crappy, but they produced a lot of them. And they believed that the more volume they made, the more money they could make. Cultural and economic changes. In Soviet cities, women entered the workforce. During World War II, there were women that actually fought on the front lines. There was a group of women who actually were snipers during World War II. Once you see what Germany had done to the Soviet Union as far as atrocities, then you're kind of on their side cheering them on. The conservative shift. Divorce was difficult to obtain. They wanted to keep the families together. Abortion was made illegal except in emergency situations, and homosexuality was declared a criminal offense. The Great Terror took place between 1937 and 1938, as if the Great Famine and all these purges were not enough. There were 1 million dead. There was 1.5 million sent to a gulag, and there was the elimination of Stalin's enemies, real or imagined. Paranoia, including his first wife, believe it or not. Industrial managers, intellectuals, and military were thrown into gulags, and ethnic groups were targeted for cleansing. Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Koreans. And Stalin was in total control. There was no Congress or Duma or any. There was a Duma, but it didn't do anything. Nobody dared buck Stalin in the actions that he took. There were social advances. Illiteracy was reduced. Higher education made available to more people. There was government assistance for working mothers, and there was free hospitalization. Well, nothing's free. Somebody's got to pay for it. In the aftermath of war, World War I, there was a democracy in distress, several thousand dead and 15 billion in debt, and there were territorial. This is Italy. I'm sorry. Now we're moving to Italy. There were militant nationalists who seized Fiume, which was a city on the coast by the Mediterranean Ocean. There were problems. There was split between the industrial north and the agrarian south, and it's always been like that in Italy. Even when the immigrants were coming over here, northern Italians did not associate with southern Italians because they considered them barbaric. Conflict over land, wages, and local power, government corruption and indecision, inflation, unemployment and strikes, and demands for radical reform. Benito Mussolini would rise. He was a newspaper editor that actually started he deserted from the army, and he became the leader of the fascists. He wrote for the Avantia, which was the local socialist daily, and he lost the editorship when he urged Italy to side with the Allies during World War I. He founded Il Popolo d'Italia and the Fasci, which was designed after an axe, an ancient Italian axe. I believe it was Etruscan. He organized to drum up support for the war. He attracted young, idealistic, fanatical nationalists, people with love of country. They loved Italy. The fascist platform in 1919 was universal suffrage, the 8-hour day, and taxes on inheritance. Fascist support gained respect of the middle classes and landowners and repressed radical movements of workers and peasants. They attacked the socialists. 50,000 fascist militia marched on Rome on October 28, 1922. They were known as the Black Shirts, and they beat up anybody in their way. Victor Emmanuel III invited Mussolini to form a cabinet because he didn't want to fight against Mussolini because he saw the power that he had with the fascist movement. Italy under Mussolini was a one-party dictatorship. Statism was nothing above, outside, or against the state. Nationalism, the highest form of society, and militarism, the ennoblement of man in war. What Mussolini wanted to do was he wanted to build a civilization kind of like Roman civilization, like it was before. And we can see later on when the Nazi Party gains power, they start to have these parades with all these flags and these banners and things of that nature. And it starts to look like that. So these were the three ideals of a fascist state. He changed the electoral laws and abolished the cabinet system. Mussolini assumed the role of prime minister and party leader, and he later became known as Il Duce. There was repression and censorship all over the place. There was no such thing as freedom of speech in Italy, especially when you talked against the government. He was all for ending class conflict, a managed economy, a corporate state. He granted independence to the papal residents in the Vatican so that they didn't fall under fascist rule. Roman Catholicism is established as the state religion and maintaining the status quo and making the trains run on time. It doesn't mean it was successful. In November 9th, 1918, there was a revolution. There was a bloodless overthrow of the imperial government. And in Italy, in Weimar, Germany. Oh, we're going to Germany now. Okay, let's go to Germany. Boy, that was a nice segue. The Social Democratic Party, the SPD, announced a new German republic. And the Kaiser Wilhelm, abdicated. He left his throne there. So that he actually left the country is what he did. Socialists wanted democratic reforms within existing imperial bureaucracy. Well, that wasn't going to happen. There were problems. Elections weren't held until January 1919. Now remember, Germany didn't lose the war militarily. The citizens pulled it out of the war because they were tired of the deprivations. Communists and independent socialists staged armed uprisings in Berlin. The Social Democrats tried to crush the uprisings, and the martyrdom of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. You can read about them in your textbook. The Freikorps was a organization of former army officers who were fighting against Bolsheviks, Poles, and communists. Bolsheviks were trying to get a foothold in Germany at that time because they realized the government was just non-existent. They called themselves Spartacists. They were fiercely right-wing, anti-Marxist, anti-Semitic, which means they didn't like Jews, and anti-liberal. The Weimar Coalition, socialists, Catholic, centrists, and liberal Democrats. There was the parliamentary liberalism. It was pluralistic framework, a lot of groups at once, universal suffrage for men and women, and there was a Bill of Rights. Well, there was another party that was coming up then, and I'll get to that in just a second. The failure of Weimar, social, political, and economic crises, the humiliation of World War I, they felt that Germany had been stabbed in the back by socialists and Jews. So when Adolf Hitler comes to power, he blames the Jews solely for that particular failure. What was needed was authoritarian leadership. Well, also, Germans started to think about the Treaty of Versailles, which we discussed after World War I, and reparations. There was $33 billion in debt that Germany had to repay. And there was a Dawes Plan, which came up with a new schedule of payments later on in 1924 that allowed Germany to make those payments and get out of debt. But it wouldn't come without a price. The government continued to print money, and by October 1923, a pound of potatoes cost 40 million marks. A lot of times people that when they were working, if they went to work, they had to get their check in the morning and cash it, because by afternoon it'd probably be worth nothing. Middle-class employees, farmers, and workers are hit the hardest by inflation. Now, what is inflation? It's when you print more money than you have a substance or an asset to back it up, which makes the money virtually worthless. Okay, it devalues what backs it up. The economic recovery of 1925 scaled down reparation payments, and there were government-sponsored building projects, which is kind of like what happened in the United States during the Great Depression with the Tennessee Valley Authority and all these work programs that Roosevelt put forth. By the time the world hit the Great Depression, it didn't just affect the United States, it affected all countries around the world. So there were some problems in Germany. There were further problems. There was the United States stock market crash, unemployment, production dropped considerably in Germany. There was high rate inflation. There was hyperinflation. Excuse me, that picture at the beginning that you saw was children who were playing with loads of money because it was worthless. Unemployment. Peasants staged mass demonstrations. The government cut off welfare benefits because they didn't have any money, and it left the door open for opponents of Weimar, including the National German Workers' Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which today we know as the Nazis. Okay, so it leaves the door open in Germany for all these other considerations that are vying for power. Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 at Braunau am Inn in Austria, and he wanted to be an artist. He spent his youth as a tramp in Vienna. He hated Jews, he hated communists, and he was for some of the Slavic peoples. The outbreak of World War I, he considered his liberation. After the war, he joined the German Workers' Party. Now, he didn't necessarily join the German Workers' Party. He was assigned as a political officer to spy on them. And when he did that, he let the government know just exactly what they were up to. And in 1920, the German Workers' Party became the National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, and they refused to accept the resolution that the Weimar Republic was going to govern Germany. This is a map of Germany. It shows a lot of them, actually a map of Europe that shows everybody that lost territory as a result of World War I. Hitler and the Nazis in November 1922, they did what was known as the Beer Hall Putsch, which was a coup to take over Germany. Adolf Hitler wound up getting arrested and was sentenced to Spandau prison for a period of 5 years. Now, while he was in prison, the government was kind of sympathetic toward him. He had a lot of supporters in the government, so it wasn't like he was in prison. It was like he had his own apartment. And while he was in prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. I do not recommend, well, I can recommend that you read it to understand his mindset, but it doesn't really have any type of, it rambles on. They're run-on sentences. He changes topics frequently. There's no transitions or anything like that. He portrayed himself as the savior of the German people. Now, he wasn't born in Germany. He was born in Austria, which is a whole other country. Okay? The Nazi elections in 1924, the Nazis polled 6.6% of the vote. Oh, by the way, Mein Kampf became a bestseller during that time, and people began to read it. In 1928, politics polarized the left and the right. There was the impossibility of a coalition where different parties get together to govern together of a particular country. And people abandoned traditional political parties. Well, he hired a guy by the name of Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels had a club foot, so he walked with a limp, and he always talked about the master race. And this is where we start to see the rise of the Aryan belief in German exceptionality. The Aryan race was supposed to be 6'2", blonde hair, blue eyes. Okay, well, Adolf Hitler was nowhere near 6'2", and he didn't have blonde hair or blue eyes. So Joseph Goebbels started making what they call propaganda, which is no truth. It's just stuff that the government puts out, and they put it out so often, and they lie so much. Excuse me, that they want people to believe it. Okay, but Goebbels was in charge of it and did it very effectively. Started making movies about Jews and, filming rats in the sewers and saying that the Jews were, parasites. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler said that often as well. He said that the Jews are parasites and that they come in and they infect a particular civilization and they wear it down and rot it from within. Nazi supporters were small property owners and rural middle classes, elite civil servants. In the 1930 election, the Nazis won 107 of 577 seats in the Reichstag, which is their Congress. No party gained a majority, so the Nazis supported no coalition government that if Hitler wasn't the head of it, they weren't going to support it. So what happens is the Nazi Party starts telling people, that, okay, in order for the Nazis to gain control and in order for the civilization, this country to be taken care of, we have to take control of your firearms, your health care, and oversee everything that you do. And the people really fell for it. If you see, like, from this picture, these are all members of the Nazi Party. This is at Nuremberg. It's a still image from Leni Riefenstahl called Triumph of the Will. It was a movie made in 1935. It was about the Nazi Party rallies in Nuremberg, Germany. Hitler was portrayed as a good guy. Anti-Semitism was not new. It had been around for a long time, especially since the Middle Ages. The Jews were blamed for a lot of things, including the death of Christ, and also the Black Death in Europe between 1347 and 1350, which killed over 100 million people. So it was nothing new, and Germany wanted to blame somebody. Hitler wanted to blame somebody because he wanted all culpability of losing the war to go to somebody else other than the German people. Hitler became chancellor in January 1933. Hindenburg, who was the president, he was aging and he was dying, appointed Hitler as chancellor. And in 1933, there was a fire that was set by a Dutch anarchist. Anarchist is somebody that wants to take control of the government by force. And Hitler blamed the communists. So here was a reason that he had to round up all the communists and send them to concentration camps. This is going to be on the test. So the final. The first concentration camp was built in 1933 at a place called Dachau. Okay, and it was basically meant to house political prisoners. Then later it took in Jehovah's Witnesses, social reformers, homosexuals, gypsies, transients, put them in the concentration camps. Hitler suspended civil rights, which means like habeas corpus. You have to be, while you're being arrested, civil rights like freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Those things were suspended by Adolf Hitler. In March 5th, 1933, let me go back a little bit. 1933, there were new elections, and Hitler was granted unlimited powers for 4 years, 1933, and he proclaimed the Third Reich. The First Reich was during Frederick the Great. The Second Reich was under Kaiser Wilhelm I, Kaiser Wilhelm II's father, where he declared it at Versailles. And now this was the Third Reich, which Hitler declared would last 1,000 years. It only lasted 12, basically. But things started to heat up in Germany. It was a one-party state, just like Italy and the Soviet Union. And they had what they called Gauleiters, which were regional directors of the nation. They were basically informers. Anybody that said anything against the government, they would report it to their superiors. A lot of propaganda coming out. Opposition stormtroopers, the SA, were used to maintain party discipline, but they would also beat people up on the street, okay, who didn't agree with Adolf Hitler's running of the country or any of the laws that he was coming up with. On June 30th, 1934, it's known as the Night of the Long Knives. The Night of the Long Knives was a way for the... there was a fight going on within the Nazi Party between the SA, which were stormtroopers, and the Schutzstaffel, which was the SS, who were later going to control the concentration camps. They were an elite guard. And what happened was they wanted to eliminate any opposition to Adolf Hitler within the party, and they also wanted to get rid of the homosexuals because there was a lot of homosexuals in the party. And so one of them was known as Ernst Röhm, and he and this guy, Heinrich Himmler, were fighting over power within the party, and Hitler just didn't want that anymore. So the Night of the Long Knives, SS members went out and actually offered people who were kind of fighting amongst each other and these homosexuals a chance to die with honor. You kill yourself, or we're going to kill you, and you're not going to die with honor. Your family won't get a pension or anything like that. So that's what it was called, the Night of the Long Knives, which is essentially a purge of the Nazi Party, which is what Stalin did as far as the military was concerned in the 1930s. And so Adolf Hitler was the firm leader of the Nazi Party as well as Germany. Excuse me. There was a Nazi boycott of Jewish shops in Berlin in 1933. The following year, there would be a series of laws called the Nuremberg Laws that were passed in 1934 in the Reichstag, basically limiting Jews to what they could make. For instance, one of the big concerns for Adolf Hitler was purifying German blood, where it was against the law to have a baby with a Jewish person. You had to have your lineage checked for Jewish ancestry. If you had a Jewish doctor, you had to find another doctor. You couldn't go to him if you were a Gentile or non-Jew. Things of that nature. Lawyers couldn't practice. So it basically took away a lot of livelihoods for them, and they had no choice but to leave. And at the beginning of the Nazi regime, around 1935, they started allowing Jews to leave, but they had to give up everything, including whatever money they had in the bank. Some of them did, and they went to live in Palestine, which would later be known as Israel, in 1947. The Schutzstaffel was the most dreaded arm of Nazi terror. They were known as the Death's Head army, basically. In German, the word is Totenkopfbund, which is Death's Head in German, Toten. And it was organized by Heinrich Himmler, who was a chicken farmer. That was his claim to fame. Later rose to power in the Nazi Party and would be in charge of the concentration camps and the death camps and building them. And finally, in 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, he was responsible for coming up with the final solution to the Jewish question, which was to eliminate Jews, and we're going to do it faster. And they started using gas, but that's a little bit for later. He was fighting against political and racial enemies. He had support. He played off the fears of communism, and he spoke a language of national pride, using nationalism for wicked means is what was going on. Now, Hitler was a symbol of a strong, revitalized Germany. He was known as the Führer, or Der Führer in German, which means the leader, and it was a cult. The Nazis were big into the occult, devil worship, and not devil worship, but forbidden knowledge, let's just say. And he was very charismatic, and the reason for that is a lot of times when he gave speeches in auditoriums at night, he would use lights, and they would hit. Excuse me. They would kind of hypnotize people that were watching him. And he also basically he took theater classes in order to be more animated when he made his speeches. And if you watch him, he's banging his hands and stuff like that. Well, it's kind of reminiscent of Huey Long. Huey Long used to bang his hands a lot too. And what he wanted to do was recover German glory, the Teutonic Knights of the medieval times during the Crusades. He wanted to recapture that type of glory for Germany, and he believed all these racial policies that he put into effect against the Jews were actually going to work to those ends. National recovery, he sealed Germany off from the rest of the world, and unemployment dropped from 6 million to 200,000. Now, what he was doing is he was spending whatever money the country had on military. He was building up the military, going against the Versailles Treaty, because they were only supposed to have 100,000 men total in their armed forces. Excuse me. And they had more than that, and he was building up the army, and he was trying to get everybody on board with what he was doing. And the Germans read his book. It became a bestseller. It's poorly written, but it was written by Der Führer, so it must be gospel. He outlawed trade unions and strikes, and he froze wages, organized workers into the National Labor Front. They had popular organizations that cut across class lines. The Hitlerjuden, Hitler Youth Group, was a way it was like a Boy Scout thing for Nazis. And they trained young children in the Nazi ideology. And they also convinced these children, brainwashed them into turning in their parents if their parents spoke against the Nazi Party. The National Labor Force was it put everybody to work. Now, please understand what I'm trying to say here. If it had not been for the Holocaust and the racial policies in World War II, Hitler would have gone down in history as a good statesman. Okay, but it was those other things that kind of detracted from it. Because he brought the country out of the Depression, he brought the country out of inflation, gave everybody jobs, gave them a sense of purpose. But even though, the road to hell is always paved with good intentions. So, he gave them a purpose, but at what cost? Nazi racism inherited from the 19th century opinions. Anti-Semitism was joined by nationalist anti-Jewish theory. And the Jew was considered an outsider. And they gave as an example a case called the Dreyfus Affair, which occurred in France in the 1894. Captain Dreyfus was a French army officer who worked in the intelligence division, and he was framed for espionage, and he was sent to prison. And later on, he was acquitted. He was vindicated, and but the reason why he was prosecuted was not because they thought he was a traitor. It's because they thought because they knew he was Jewish. And so it was a lot of anti-Semitism going on at that time. There was a wave of late 19th century pogroms in Eastern Europe, and pogroms are legalized discrimination against Jews. And that's why we had a large influx of immigrants to the United States from Eastern Europe during that time, was because of these pogroms, because they wanted to leave the discrimination and they wanted to leave the countries that were oppressing them. Hitler believed it was an international Jewish conspiracy to rule the world, and he set about to get rid of the Jews. When World War II started, then he started the concentration camps. Actually, the concentration camps were built earlier, but then they started turning them into death camps wherein the German army would go into particular places they had what was called Einsatzgruppen. They had Einsatzgruppen A through D, and the Einsatzgruppen's job was they were called Special Action Squads. And when the army would go in, the Einsatzgruppen would follow, and they would round up all the Jews, and they would execute them. It got a little costly because they were shooting them, having them dig large pits, and they would put the bodies into those pits. In April of 1933, there were new racial laws which excluded Jews from public office, and in 1935 were the Nuremberg Decrees, which deprived Jews of citizenship, which was determined by their bloodline. So even if you had fought for Germany in World War I and you were a Jew, you were no longer considered a German. In November 1938 was Kristallnacht, which was the night of the broken glass, all over Germany, where Jewish shops were smashed. Police were not arresting anyone for doing that, the rioting and the looting. And it became a way of saying, Jew get out, Jew leave Germany. This is what we want. It's kind of like a final warning before they started with the mass roundups and sending them away to concentration camps. National Socialism and Fascism both arose in the interwar period as responses to war and revolution. It was intensely nationalistic, and it opposed parliamentary government and democracy. It favored mass-based authoritarian regimes. Okay. Western democracies, France, they continued to fear Germany. They could see what was going on. After what happened to France in World War I and Britain in World War II, France was scared to death as to what was going on in Germany. They had a policy of deflating the German currency when it was used in France, and there was class conflict and labor troubles in France at the same time. In Britain, there was a policy of deflation where there was a reduction in wages and decline in the standard of living. The Labour Party took control in 1924 and 29, and they increased trade union militancy. A lot of people were looking at what was going on in Europe, and they were kind of disagreed with how Britain was being ruled at the time. The United States was a bastion of conservatism. They were the presidents and the Supreme Court. And also, the United States had taken on a view of isolationism after World War I. They didn't want to get involved in any more European conflicts. The Great Depression occurred in the United States. The stock market crash took place in about 1929 in October, and then the Great Depression started a little less than a year after that in 1930. And there was an instability in national currencies because how all these nations were recovering from World War I and all these periods of unemployment. So what you see is the United States is just going, hey, we got problems of our own. We can't worry about anybody else. Meanwhile, you got the League of Nations that's still there trying to solve any type of disputes, and they have no army, so they can't back it up. Interdependence of national economies, widespread drop in industrial productivity, and the restriction of free trade because a lot of nations were not taking chances when it came to the economy. In October 1929, there was a collapse of the New York Stock Exchange. New York was seen as the world's creditor nation. People came to us to borrow money. There was immediate and disastrous consequences for the European economy. Banking houses closed, and manufacturers laid off entire workforces. It was horrible. British response, government response, was they abandoned the gold standard and free trade, which was a mistake because the gold actually backed up their money, and free trade would have allowed for more goods to be sold. There were very cautious relief efforts because it affected everybody. In France, the Popular Front under Léon Blum was gaining popularity. It nationalized the munitions industry, gave a 40-hour week and fixed the price and regulated the distribution of grain. That's one way of doing it, but you're isolating yourself. In the United States, FDR was elected president in 1932 with the slogan, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And he was trying to have a recovery without destroying capitalism, and managing the economy and public works projects under the guidance of a guy named John Maynard Keynes. I don't believe in Keynesian economics, but a lot of people didn't back then, but they saw him as the authority on it. There was a rejection of tradition in the experiment with new forms of expression, the interwar intellectuals, disillusionment with war, and the failure of victory, frustration, cynicism, and disenchantment. This was all over the place as far as artistic expressions were concerned. Ernest Hemingway was a writer, famous writer. He wrote The Sun Also Rises about the lost generation. T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, Life is a Living Death. And William Butler Yeats deplored the superficiality of modern life because these people remember what it was like before all this foolishness with World War I and the Great Depression were going on, all out of a sense of greed, basically. Bertolt Brecht, The Pointlessness of War, High Culture and Middle-Class Values. James Joyce wrote Ulysses in 1922, which was a stream of consciousness. And a lot of the literature at the time was politicized. Interwar artists wrote developments paralleled those in literature. There was a dominance of the avant-garde, which is slightly abstract and kind of way out there. Nothing is specific. And subjective experience. There was a multiplicity of meanings and personal expression. There was a rejection of traditional forms and values and pushing the boundaries of aesthetics. What I failed to mention earlier in Germany is right after World War I, there was a period of decadence where there was prostitution was open in the streets, homosexuality was open in the streets, according to that definition of decadence. And drinking and sleeping in the open and just a lot of things were going on. And a lot of people saw the Nazis as control over that. That's why they went from the extreme left to the extreme right with Nazism. Expressionism, we're back at the paintings now. Needed to have subjects. They didn't have to have subjects at all. Vasily Kandinsky, his improvisations meant nothing. And here's my point about abstract art. If you don't know what it means, how are we going to know what it means? George Grosz attacked the greed and decadence of post-war Europe. The Dadists, Marcel Duchamp, Max Ernst, and Hans Arp, these are artists, rejected forms of artistic conventions, haphazard fabrications. They made it up as they went along. Meaningful and playful works or expressions of the unconscious mind. So we start to see a little expansion here into what I would call the world of bizarro. I'm kind of one of these traditionalists when it comes to artistic value. What are you painting a picture of? Is it a landscape? Is it an individual? Is it a family or an event? Something like that. I can't look at a picture that has a circle with a dot in the middle and come up with anything other than it's a circle with a dot in the middle. Okay, or it looks like a target, or something like that. So this was that period where they started going through abstract painting. Surrealism was a form of painting. Giorgio de Chirico and Salvador Dali, they explored the interior of the mind, but there were political undertones within their work. Art for a mass audience was Diego Rivera and Jose Clemente Orozco, Thomas Hart Benton and Reginald Marsh. They depicting social conditions of the modern world. Those made a little bit more sense because they actually had people in them, and the hopes and struggles of ordinary people. Architecture, functionalism, Otto Wagner and Le Corbusier, Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, form ever follows function. Okay, a lot of architecture didn't follow any function. There was no function to it. So this is form follows function. Ornamentation to reflect an age of science and machines. Walter Gropius and Bauhaus was an international type of style. And of course, there was the science world as well. Albert Einstein, we've all heard of him, revolutionized modern physics, and he challenged our beliefs about the universe using science. There were new ways of thinking about space, matter, and time and gravity, and time was the fourth dimension, and he came up with the theory of relativity, which is E equals mc squared. James Chadwick discovered the neutron in 1932. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann split atoms of uranium and released a lot of energy in 1939, and that would later come into play when we talk about the atomic age. It was a chain reaction. Werner Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle. There's a lot of philosophic things going on at the time. Relativity and uncertainty as metaphors for the ambiguity of modern life, because a lot of people were uncertain because of the economic situation. Mass culture and its possibilities. There was an explosive rise of mass media, media for the masses. There were more movies being made. There were more programs being produced for radio, kind of keep people occupied off their daily lives. So there was mass politics were a fact of life. People had to understand that politics is what basically ruled it, parts of their life. It cut across class lines, ethnicity and nationality, democratic and authoritarian possibilities. The radio became very big. In Europe, there were broadcasting rights were owned by the government. In the United States, broadcasting was managed by corporations. Okay, so in Europe, radio had to broadcast what the government told them to do, or approve. They had to approve of what they were broadcasting. There was a national soapbox for politicians. FDR had fireside chats on the radio, letting people know, hey, look, everything's going to be fine. We're going to have freedom from want, freedom from fear. But it was also used on the flip side of that for Nazi propaganda prior to World War II. There was a new ritual of political life, communication, and persuasion. In advertising, visual images replaced older ads. That's when advertisers started to determine that sex sells, so let's use pictures of young girls that are all dolled up so we could sell our products. Efficient communication was streamlined and standardized, and it drew on modern psychology. In film, in France and Italy, they had strong film industries. 1927 ended the talking era. Started the talking era. Silent films were ended with the first movie in the United States called The Jazz Singer. It's the first movie to have sound. And the United States gained a competitive edge in Europe, the size of the home market, and there were huge investments in equipment and distribution. And we started to see what was known as the Hollywood star system. In those days, stars had contracts to individual studios. Nowadays, they can be contracted by a particular studio to star in a movie that the studio is producing. Back then, when you worked for one studio, you only worked for that studio. Okay? Germany had the best equipped studios in Europe. Universum Film AG, Fritz Murnau, he did Der letzte Mann in 1924. And he also did a movie called Nosferatu in 1922, which was a German adaptation of Dracula, which is a pretty creepy movie. Fritz Lang did Metropolis in 1926, and Metropolis was about a futuristic society, but M happened to be a movie about a child serial killer by the name of Peter Kürten. If you look him up on the internet, you'll see what kind of deranged, deviant individual he was. The Americanization of culture was a threat to, was it a threat to European culture? Who knows? Introduced Europe to new ways of life. Stalin and socialist realism, Mussolini and the classical kitsch, and Hitler despised modern art as decadent. Remember, Hitler was an artist. He was rejected from admission into the Vienna Academy of Art because they said he couldn't do portraits But he did some pretty decent portraits. If you look up some of his work, I'm not praising Adolf Hitler. I'm just telling you, he did some pretty decent stuff as an artist. Leni Riefenstahl actually became a propagandist for the Nazi Party, and she made a film called Triumph of the Will, which was basically a semi-autobiographical documentary about Adolf Hitler and how he came to rise to the Nazi Party and how the Nazis were now had control of Germany. Tried to limit influence of American popular culture, dance, and jazz. I know for a fact that swing music was not allowed. Swing music, Glenn Miller, the big bands from the 1930s and 1940s, jazz was limited. They wouldn't let it run in Germany. It was outlawed because they thought it was going to be somewhat of an influence on the youth. In 1940, they wrote, they did The Eternal Jew and Jew Seuss, and these were particular types of